So, what happens when a horror movie becomes self-aware? We're going to talk about it on the Horror Movie Syllabus. Welcome back to the Horror Movie Syllabus. I'm your host, Professor Victor, and here's where we talk about all the most noteworthy horror films. If you're new to the Horror Movie Syllabus, I highly recommend you check out our introduction video. I'll leave a link to it in the description below. That video will give you a good explanation of what it is we do here at the Horror Movie Syllabus. But in short, what we do is we look at the 3 best films in a particular subgenre of horror, and today we're talking about postmodern horror films. So what exactly is postmodern? Well, I'm not going to go into the whole explanation of the postmodern movement and talk about literature and architecture because you're here for horror movies. So let's just say that when it comes to horror movies, a postmodern horror film is a movie that defies the horror movie conventions and is somewhat self-aware. If you're still not quite sure what we mean by postmodern horror films, stick around and maybe it'll become more clear to you as we go through a few of the examples. Now today's 3 movies are going to be categorized by undergraduate, graduate, and postgraduate like we do here at the Horror Movie Syllabus. This time those levels are going to indicate the escalating level of importance or impact that these movies have had on the horror genre as a whole, with our postgraduate movie being the most impactful of the bunch. So, getting right into it, our first movie in our exploration in the postmodern horror subgenre, the undergraduate selection, is Behind the Mask, The Rise of Leslie Vernon. This movie is somewhat of a little-known horror gem. I think that a lot of people that aren't diehard horror fans probably aren't really even aware of it. It never really seemed to receive the same level of attention of, say, a Freddy Krueger or Jason Voorhees. And I think the filmmakers probably had high hopes that it would, given the title of the movie. But the format of the movie probably doesn't really lend itself to that kind of mainstream popularity. The movie is a mock documentary that takes place in a world where Jason, Freddy, Michael Myers are all real characters that actually exist and actually murder people. The documentary follows an up-and-coming serial killer named Leslie Vernon as he plots out his killing spree. As usual, I don't like to spoil movies for you, so I'll leave it there. Although YouTuber Ryan Hollinger recently did a video on Behind the Mask where he goes through the movie and explains how all of the mockumentary footage works in a way to tell the story that is unique and fun and makes it a little bit more interesting than the standard horror movie. I'd recommend checking out Ryan's video. In fact, I'll leave a link to it in the description below. However, don't watch that video until you've seen the movie because Ryan does go into spoilers. Now, as I mentioned, the movie is in the mockumentary format, a fake documentary. Now, you might notice that mockumentary is a subgenre on the Horror Movie Syllabus, but I didn't put this movie into that subgenre because I think that the overall theme of the movie really is about a more postmodern take. By setting itself in a world where Jason, Michael Myers, and the like are real serial killers, it is already turning itself into something that is defying the horror conventions. It's self-aware of the horror movie tropes and likes to play with them. A particular fun part is Leslie Vernon explaining how he has to keep up his cardio in order to keep up with the kids and look like he's walking really slowly. It's a tremendous amount of fun, especially if you're a fan of the slasher subgenre of horror, because that's the subgenre that it's probably poking the most amount of fun at. That said, I do think you could enjoy it on its own just because the tropes that it's making fun of have become so ubiquitous and universal that even the most casual fan probably understands them. Now again, I don't want to go into spoilers, but there is a point in the movie that things change and you're either going to go with that or you're not. I really like that part of the movie, but I've talked to other people who say that that is where the movie kind of lost it for them. If you've seen the movie, you know exactly what point I'm talking about. But if you haven't seen the movie, give it a watch and let us know in the comments what you thought of that particular moment. The next movie we're going to be talking about, our graduate level movie, is The Cabin in the Woods. I love The Cabin in the Woods. It is absolutely incredible. It's one of those rare movies that the hype had built around it for a long time before I actually got a chance to see it, but it not only met the expectations I had, which were admittedly very, very high, it actually exceeded those expectations. The movie comes from the mind of Joss Whedon and his frequent collaborator Drew Goddard, and if you're familiar with those names, then you know the kind of quality you're in for when you see this movie. I think the movie came out in the early 2010s. I'd have to fact check myself to be sure about that. But I know that it had been made many years earlier than that and basically sat on a shelf for a really long time. It had been seen at a few horror movie festivals, and the buzz had gotten out about it that it was an absolutely phenomenal, game-changing type of movie, but people were very careful to not spoil the film. I will take the same approach and not spoil it for you here. All I'll say is that a bunch of kids go to a cabin in the woods and things happen. Honestly, the best way to go into this movie is blind. It will surprise you in ways that you could never see coming that will delight you to no end. I'd say it's a love letter to horror fans in a way. The more you're familiar with horror movies of all subgenres, the more you're going to appreciate this movie. But even if you're new to horror, you will still have a lot of fun. The dialogue is sharp, the acting is particularly good, and it's just a fresh, original idea that you'll be able to tell is fresh and original, even if you haven't seen horror movies beat certain tropes to death. The movie stars a pre-Thor Chris Hemsworth, Bradley Whitford, and a few other faces that, if you're familiar with a lot of Joss Whedon's other work, you'll probably recognize their faces. Everybody is extremely good in the movie, and it's just a lot of fun. I do adore the movie. I haven't talked to anybody who doesn't love the movie, so I'm maybe building up the expectations a little bit high, but I think it'll live up to those expectations. If you haven't seen it, definitely check it out. Our final movie for the postmodern subgenre of horror, our postgraduate level film, Scream. Of course it's Scream. I mean, Scream is basically the movie that defined the postmodern subgenre of horror. And that's why it's our postgraduate level film. It is incredibly important in horror movie history. Allow me to explain. Scream comes out in the mid-90s at a period of time when horror movies are terrible. The state of the horror genre as a whole is pretty bleak, and the movies that are coming out are derivative, they're laughable, they're not terribly scary, they're definitely not innovative. People are losing interest in the genre as a whole. To give you an idea of just how bad it is, at this point in time, I'm not really that into horror movies. Me, Professor Victor, of the Horror Movie Syllabus, is not into horror movies at this point in time. So when Scream came out, I remember seeing the trailer in the theaters. I remember seeing commercials about it. And I was like, nah. I was burned out on horror movies. I was over it, especially the slasher subgenre, which was maybe my favorite subgenre of horror. And I didn't want to see this movie. However, some friends went and saw it. And when my friend came back, she said, you have to see this movie. And I was again, nah. But she convinced me, mostly because the star of the movie was Drew Barrymore, and I'm a Drew Barrymore fan, so she kind of sold me on that. And that was a wise decision on her part. Now, spoiler alert if you haven't seen Scream, and if you haven't, go see it right now, and then come back to this video and watch the rest of this video. Okay, so you're back, and now you've seen the movie, and you know that Drew Barrymore is not the star of this movie. Again, I have to impress upon you that at the time, she was billed as the star of the movie, and she was probably the most famous person in the movie at that period in time. And of course, they kill her off in the first scene. A brilliant, brilliant first scene. It was a shocking moment, and I was stunned. My jaw hit the floor. I looked over at my friend who had come to see it with me again because she liked the movie that much, and I'm looking at her in disbelief, and she's like, it was an incredible moment. And from that moment on, not only was I in on that movie, I was back in on horror. And I'm not the only person who had that experience either. I think a lot of people were out on horror, and Scream's the movie that brought them back in. It was a much needed breath of fresh air at a time when we really needed it in the horror genre. Scream is directed by horror legend Wes Craven, who has directed a lot of other movies that are on the Horror Movie Syllabus. And that adds an extra layer of fun to the movie because Wes Craven is poking fun at his own movies and the movies of his peers, guys like John Carpenter, another guy that's on the Horror Movie Syllabus quite a bit. And that's what makes the movie feel so fresh and original. It's wildly self-aware of the existence of horror films, how tired and cliche their tropes have become, and it turns all of that on its head. Scream works on its surface level as a horror film. It's actually pretty tense and scary, but it works on a meta level that is next level, if you're familiar with horror films. So I definitely recommend seeing it after you've seen a few of the other classics, such as Halloween and Friday the 13th and A Nightmare on Elm Street, Carrie, all the movies that we're talking about on the horror movie syllabus, basically. That's where you'll really get the best experience out of Scream. That's where you're going to get the most value or the most reward out of watching that movie. The movie's just clever. It really turns all of these tropes on its head. It uses your knowledge of horror movies against you. You expect certain things to happen and then they don't happen. That to me is the epitome of what a postmodern horror film is, making you not trust your expectations anymore. And Scream does it maybe the best I've ever seen. So that's why we've picked it as our postgraduate level representative of the postmodern subgenre of horror. It's an iconic film. It's essential viewing for the horror movie fan. If you haven't seen it, go see it. Let all of us in the comments know what you thought of it. So those are our 3 picks for the essential postmodern horror films. But as usual, I'd like to give you a few extra credit films in case you really like this subgenre. The first one I'm going to tell you about is Wes Craven's New Nightmare. Now, we just talked about Wes Craven making Scream. New Nightmare is the movie that he did before Scream, and it was supposed to be the final entry in the Freddy Krueger series, the Nightmare on Elm Street series. And if you watch that movie, you'll see a lot of the precursors to what eventually wound up in the movie Scream. It's a very meta film taking place in the real world with the people who made the Nightmare on Elm Street movies, and a demon that was the inspiration for Freddy Krueger is terrorizing them. I absolutely love the film. At the time, it was critically panned and fans didn't particularly care for it. I do think that people are coming around to it a little bit more now, and I've noticed there are more fans who actually say they like it. I love it. I think it's not as good as Scream, mostly because the ending is not quite that good. But up until that point, I think it's clever, fun, and if you're a fan of the Nightmare on Elm Street series, I think you'll enjoy that one a lot. The next extra credit film we're going to mention is My Name is Bruce, starring horror film icon Bruce Campbell. If you've seen the Evil Dead series, you know who Bruce Campbell is. We actually will talk about him quite a bit in the horror movie syllabus. But he is the showcase of this movie, and it is a campy good time. It's a horror film, but it's also a movie where Bruce Campbell plays Bruce Campbell. And you know, if you know Bruce Campbell, that that's a good thing. I'm saying Bruce Campbell a lot in this extra credit recommendation, but that's okay because it's Bruce Campbell. Bruce Campbell, Bruce Campbell, Bruce Campbell. And the final extra credit movie we're going to talk about is The Final Girls. The Final Girls is another meta take on the slasher subgenre of horror. It does a good job of sending up the slasher tropes and motifs that we've become familiar with, but I think the thing I like about it the most is that it has a surprising amount of heart in it. A lot of that's due to the performances of the actresses in the film, who I think are really good in it. Malin Eckerman is not somebody I usually think of as a really good actress, but she's really good in this movie. And Taissa Farmiga, not sure if I'm pronouncing that right, is very good here. She's usually good in pretty much everything I see her in, though. But the two of them together have a lot of chemistry, and it makes the movie work really well. Definitely recommend. Now, you may be wondering where some of the other noteworthy postmodern horror films are and why they weren't mentioned in this list. It's possible that they're popping up on other subgenres in the horror movie syllabus. But if you've thought of a postmodern horror film that wasn't mentioned here, go ahead and leave it in the comments below and tell us why you think it should have been on the list. We'd like to get your input on those movies and see what other films we should all be taking a look at. So please contribute by commenting below. That's going to do it for postmodern horror films. Thank you for your attendance, and class dismissed.